Welcome. Welcome to Loss and Learning, Navigating Grief at University. This is a Good Grief Festival event in collaboration with the Student Grief Network. Research suggests that at least 10% of university students will experience a significant loss by the time that they graduate. That's approximately 280,000 bereaved students in the UK every year, and many more across the world. On top of this, Sue Ryder's Grief in the Workplace report found that 24% of UK employees are bereaved in any given year. So that's almost a quarter of the UK workforce. And yet, grief remains a largely unspoken subject, and the support for those experiencing grief remains limited a lot of the time. In this session, we're going to be exploring the challenges of grieving at university and how we can improve support for students and staff, including introducing elements of the new higher education bereavement framework that I've put together through my work with the Student Grief Network. So I'm Anna May. I'm the founder of the Student Grief Network and executive head of grief programs at Kaplan International. I'm here, I guess, firstly on a personal basis. I lost my brother as a child and my dad when I started the final year of university up at the University of Leeds, and have now worked for over 7 years improving grief education and support across the higher education sector and beyond. It's a pleasure to be joined by two guests today. So firstly, Nivaetha D. Nivaetha is a psychology graduate from the University of Glasgow, where she completed her award-winning dissertation titled Navigating Loss Abroad: The Lived Experiences and Support Needs of Bereaved International Students in UK Universities. Her research provided a space for bereaved students to share their story and inform policy-level recommendations to strengthen bereavement support at UK universities. Her personal journey of losing her father during university inspired this research and continues to fuel her passion for creating compassionate and culturally sensitive support systems for those navigating grief. I'm also very happy to be joined by Theo Silberston, founder and host of Life After, which is a podcast where young people share their experiences of grief and how loss has shaped them. And I can say personally that it's a very good podcast. I've featured on it and I've also listened to many of the episodes. Theo created Life After as a space for grieving young adults after losing his dad to cancer at 8 years old and his brother to the same illness 10 years later. Beyond the podcast, Theo leads Shared Horizon, which is an organisation helping communities imagine and create more just and sustainable futures together. So, without any delay, I'm going to jump straight into the deep end. Always very good at getting to the gritty stuff. So I'm going to ask Theo and Nivi, you both lost a significant person in the middle of your time at university. Grief is a complex experience, and there's no simple way of describing it. So this is a bit of a tricky question, but if you could just pick out a few words or sentences to describe that experience of losing someone at university, what would you say? Theo, I'm going to come to you first.
Yeah, sure. And I just want to say thank you for this session, and it's lovely to be here. So I wrote down blinding. And effortful as two words. I think blinding because it's so much to deal with, and yet I think you're in a system and surrounded by people who are kind of collectively moving in a different direction. I mean, towards academic study. And so I think blinding because you're trying to deal with all of that and deal with like what's happened in your life, which is so monumental, and you don't really know what you're doing either. So yeah, and I suppose effortful because I suppose you're just trying to hang on and move through that process.
Yeah, totally. I heard someone recently say that the only phrase they'd really liked someone to say to them when they were grieving, because they didn't resonate with people saying, oh, you're so strong, or it gets better with time, and some of those more cliche phrases. But she said she really liked the phrase "hold on tight," and I think you've kind of just reflected like that's kind of the only thing you can do.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Nivi, I'm going to come to you.
Yeah. Hello. The two words that come to my mind are weight, firstly. I think when I lost my dad during my time at university, it felt like something suddenly hit me and there was all this extra weight that I was experiencing. But I think the harder part was I was not really in control of when or where the weight kicked in. So it was, trying to learn to carry that weight, but also sometimes feeling like I got strong enough to carry that weight, and then the weight would get heavier, and then I would feel a lot weaker again. So yeah, so weight was the first one I thought of, and the second one was uprooting. I think when my dad passed, it felt like a lot of what I had known and a lot of what I had learned kind of just got uprooted, and removed. And because I was away from home when I lost my dad, so my home is Singapore and I was studying in the UK, and that was obviously really far away from each other. So when my dad passed, I kind of had to leave everything behind in Glasgow and come back to Singapore. And eventually, after the funeral, and when I went back to Glasgow, sorry, I felt like everything was uprooted again. So it was just this feeling of constantly trying to find stable grounding, but not really being able to. Yeah.
And I feel like university is quite an unstable time anyway, regardless of what's going on in your personal life. I also think that word weight is interesting because when I went to university, I had this expectation that it was going to be carefree and light. And, I was going to like not have any weight in the world. I was just going to be cruising through, making friends and new experiences and all of those things. And actually then having to deal with an immense amount of grief kind of juxtaposed from those expectations. Theo, like me, you'd also experienced an earlier loss. When I went to university, I found that the earlier grief from losing my brother when I was 10 years old kind of resurfaced. And I think this was for many reasons. I think, transitioning, moving away from home, trying to figure out who I was as an adult. Also went through a breakdown of a relationship at the time, which I think that loss triggered earlier loss. I think we have this expectation that grief goes away after some time, or at least it kind of significantly lessens after the first year or so. But I really struggled even 8 years later with quite intense feelings. Do you feel like the earlier loss also impacted your time at university at all?
I think inevitably, right? Like, it completely colored who I was. And that's not to say that I was defined by my dad's death, but it certainly shaped who I had become. And certainly when my brother died, which was in my Christmas break of first year, that prior experience shaped how I responded, who I told, the kind of help that I accepted, and ultimately kind of quite a conscious decision to try and do things differently with my brother than my dad. I think I came to university as someone who, kind of classically associated vulnerability with weakness, and yet had a sense that that was eating away at me. So I think when I came to university, all of these things were kind of swimming around in my mind, and in a very, very practical sense, when going into your university halls and meeting people who you think, oh God, is this going to be someone who I know for the rest of my life? Like, those initial conversations around, tell me about your family, tell me about X, tell me about Y. I think that was something to navigate. And it's not that I hadn't done that before, but it was weighty, to use your word, Nivi.
Yeah, I think it feels like the stakes are very high. I remember Freshers Week, yeah, it'd been 8 years since my brother had died, but it still felt really present. And I think it's because there are all those questions. Yeah, how many siblings do you have? What did you do over the summer? Where do you spend, like, do you know, all of these things that,
Yeah.
and there's the question, what I found anyway, and I know I've spoken to a lot of students that have resonated with this, is like, how much of yourself do you share? Because you don't want to hold back so much that you don't want to lie about it, or you don't want to hide that part of you. But also it is a lot to share, like bare your heart on your sleeve in those first few weeks of university where everyone's, you know, thinking about how many pints they can drink, or, you know, all of the other things. So yeah, I think it's quite hard to know how to navigate new friendships, and what to say and what not to say. I think it's just also on this note really important for people to understand that support for grief isn't just about support in those early weeks and months. It might actually be something that really comes up years later. And like you said, Nivi, it's sometimes you don't know when that's going to be. Like the weight might arrive at unexpected times. So university is quite a specific time to experience grief. What do you feel are some of the unique challenges students face when grieving within a university environment that might differ from other settings? And Nivi, I'm going to come to you first.
Yeah, of course. I can think of quite a few. I think the first one is that I feel like university is a time when most people move away from their family. And it's the first, or at least for me, it was the first sense of independence I really got, where I lived away from my family and lived away from my primary support system back in Singapore. So I feel like a lot of, especially when you first enter university, it's kind of trying to find who you are as a person, trying to find your people, and it's a lot of trying to find things with that fit with you. And I think experiencing loss at a time like that can really, you know, disrupt that process of you trying to see if you fit. Because sadly, I think during university and people that you meet in university, not everyone would have experienced loss. And also, I don't think everyone would know how to have conversations about grief or loss. So it can be really, really isolating to, you know, be in an environment where you feel like no one really understands, but at the same time, you're just really trying to fit in. So that's the first one I can think of. And I think, secondly, yeah, well, somewhat similar, but like when I was in university, there was so much pressure to go out and have a good time, or just, you know, to not be cooped up in your own flat. And I found that really hard, especially my dad passed year 3, semester 2, so it was pretty late on into my university journey. But even in that time, I felt so much pressure to, you know, not stay in my room and be sad, but instead go out and meet people, especially because I was in a new city and I felt like, yeah, there was so much money and effort and time going into where I was and the opportunity I was given. So I felt quite, you know, awful about wasting that away if I was just cooped up in my room. But sometimes I just really needed it. I just needed to be away from people and just be in my own time and space. And I think thirdly, and also very importantly, I think university, the rigor and stress of university can be so much, even for someone that isn't experiencing something so big. But I think on top of that, if that's coupled with experiencing a loss, then it's a double dose of trying to, you know, juggle two things that can be quite difficult. So, like with me, like after my dad passed, there was year 3 and year 4 were quite intense academically. And I felt like I couldn't take a breather in terms of I had to do all these assignments and prepare for all these exams. And I thought juggling that was incredibly hard as well. Yeah, so I think the rigor of it all also makes it very challenging.
Yeah. I think a note on that is that there's a lot of pressure, and although you might get that in the workplace or at school as well in similar ways, what I found being at university was that I had a lot of pressure without much structure. Like I didn't have many
Yeah.
contact hours in the course that I was doing. So I was feeling like there's a huge amount of work, but it's all self-directed. And that was really hard on, like, in moments that I was struggling to kind of keep that motivation up and be able to keep up with it. Theo, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote down a couple of things. I think to your point there, like it's a period where you are learning so much, not just academically, but you're also learning how to live. You're learning yourself in a number of ways, and then you have this kind of this new element that's introduced that you don't get that much help with typically, which is, how do you interpret your own emotions in relation to grief? How do you speak to others about it? How, what are your expectations? And I think I'd like to make a broader point on that, because I think we've used that word a couple of times already, and in the university setting, I think certainly I remember feeling like, of those who decided to go to uni, like we were all, swimming in the same river. We were going one direction. It was, for me at least, it was you do school and then you go to university and then you move on. And I think experiencing loss at that time teaches you quite a valuable lesson that, we're all actually on different timelines, and life diverges depending on what you experience when. But at that stage, the people around you aren't necessarily having that same experience. Like I think I'm 27 now, and that feels a lot clearer, that notion that we're all kind of diverging now. It feels a lot more normal. But back then, I think that was against the grain of how we perhaps thought about the next 3-4 years of our lives, what we felt like those experiences should have been or should be, depending on what like our parents, our friends, broadly, like societal narratives about what university is like. So I think, yeah, the critical thing is around like the bucking of expectations, I don't necessarily use the word disappointment, but the hit with the reality of a situation that you can't control, and subsequently, not only affects that experience, but in my case, certainly, like, as I said, who I was and who I am now. So yeah.
Yeah, I do think disappointment is a word that a lot of students would relate to, of like what they hoped for and what happened. But I also think, but I have a lot of students that come to our groups that use words like unfair, like this doesn't
Yeah.
feel fair. And I try not to use that because it doesn't feel helpful to say whether something's fair or unfair. But like that is really how it can feel when you see everyone going in one direction and living life in one way, and you having had this massive blow that means that you can't do that. I think, yeah, the themes that come up most often in conversations I have with students are those feelings of disconnection, loneliness, feeling misunderstood, and also feeling completely overwhelmed and exhausted. And like it's just all too much to handle all of these different factors all at once. Yeah. Nivi, jump in.
I just had something to add to that. Like I really like the analogy of the river, and it reminded me of something I felt a lot when my dad first passed. I think at the start of university, and pretty much like during my schooling in Singapore and when I was much younger, it always felt like, I was always on the same level playing field as everybody. And then when my dad passed, it suddenly felt like we were all running the same race, but there was suddenly something that hit me and I was much further behind. And yeah, I felt like it was really, really unfair. So yeah, I agree with with the word unfair that you used, Anna, because I think that's what I really felt like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I felt like I had to grow up a lot quicker than everyone else, but I
Mm.
also had a lot of things holding me back. And there were also elements of that that I appreciated. Like, I think I learned to, get a new perspective on life. I had a chance to figure out what was really important. I felt like I built a lot more empathy for other people in the way that maybe some of my peers were still kind of figuring out. So that it wasn't all bad. Like, there were some ways that I was really grateful that I'd been able to grow up, but I also felt like it was really unfair that I basically had these years taken away from me. And yeah, really missed a lot of that more like carefree, playful side of my life.
Mm.
Nivi, I wanted to move on and ask you, because you wrote your undergraduate dissertation on the experiences of bereaved international students. Can you add anything about the challenges faced when you're studying abroad that might be felt on top of everything else?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so as Anna said, I got to do my undergrad dissertation on this, and I'm very, very grateful that I got to do it, because it was something that I felt very deeply about. And I felt like, university bereaved students were already an overlooked population, but the idea of being an international student was bereaved was, I felt like I never heard anyone talk about it. So yeah, but to answer the question, the few things that came up which I resonated a lot with and I thought were quite interesting was, firstly, like, grieving away from home really disrupted people's grieving process, in terms of, I think, quite an important part of facing the loss is facing any loss related reminders, in terms of being in the same space that you shared with the person that passed, or yeah, being in places that remind you of that memory. But as someone that is grieving away from home, you're taken away from the environment, and then that can lead to a sense of avoidance, and it can then lead to a much harder time wrapping your head around the fact that this person's passed, and no longer around. And I personally experienced that, because I flew off. It was My dad passed, I flew back to Singapore, and then it was a month of funeral, and I came back, and I didn't go back to Singapore until a year after. And I remember in the first few months there was a lot of just denial, and it was quite easy to be in denial, because my dad was never a part of my life in Glasgow. So it was only really after I came back to Singapore that it felt like I like to use the word grief slap, because that's kind of what it felt like. I came back to Singapore and I was like, oh, yeah. So that was the first one that came up quite a bit. And the second one was, people talked about experiencing social isolation and disconnection, but like a duo, in terms of people, they felt quite isolated and disconnected from people back at home, but also disconnected from people in the city they were there for university. So in terms of people back at home, there was things like time difference, just the geographical distance, and also, I mean, you can call, but sometimes digital connections are quite inadequate, and they only can reinforce that distance sometimes. So yeah, quite a few students highlighted that all of this kind of came together with feeling like, their family was grieving and moving on without them, and they felt quite isolated in that grieving journey. So that was from people back at home, but at the same time, because they were an international student and they really felt the need to, build a support system for themselves in the UK or wherever they were based. They felt the need a lot of times to mask their grief and hide it, because they were worried that it would define them in social settings. And there were a couple of students that also highlighted how, when they tried to have conversations about grief with people they had met, sometimes it was mishandled, it was misunderstood, and then that kind of reinforced the idea that this is something I need to hide away, which then established distance from potential social support they could have gotten. So then reinforcing the idea of isolation again in the context of where they were for university. And the last one, the third one, was because I got to speak to people that were of different cultural backgrounds. The thing that kept coming up was how much culture can define your experience of grief. So a lot of students shared that, yeah, as much as they could talk to people about it, their friends or university staff members, sometimes they felt like their grief was never truly understood because there were so many cultural differences that sometimes people didn't make the effort to understand or acknowledge or honor, which is, I mean, it's a really important aspect to understand what that grief and what that loss looks like to you and your culture. So the importance of that also came up, and the consequences of not accounting for that also came up. Yeah, and as a personal touch to that, I'm my religion is Hinduism, and we have quite a lot of traditions that we do in terms of funeral traditions and just traditions related to honoring a loved one. And like back in Glasgow, no one in my immediate circle was of my religion, so it was quite hard to sometimes do things and explain why I was doing it. And sometimes I felt quite misunderstood, but yeah, that also made me realize the importance of, just when someone passes, and you're hearing about it, be open enough to kind of put away what your perceptions of death and your perception of loss, and kind of just come in with an open mind and be like, tell me about what it's like for you, rather than trying to impose what it's been like for you onto them.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think so. We at the Student Grief Network, we've got a training program, and a lot of that is about not actually teaching people set things, but trying to strip away assumptions and just help people feel more open towards the subject. And we did have a module in it which I'd called cultural competence, which is about supporting people from different backgrounds and thinking about international students. But I actually recently renamed it cultural humility, because I don't think it's something that you become competent in, but it is something that you can just approach and say, I don't have all the answers. You're never going to know, every single possible cultural background and what their attitude is towards death. And even within like Hinduism, for example, it will also be dependent on your particular family and maybe where you're from and how you relate to that. So you can't know, but you can be kind of humble and say that you don't know and just try and be open towards it. I think that's, really important. We've spoken a lot about the experiences of students, and thank you both so much for kind of adding there. I just wanted to say a few lines as well about the challenges of staff, because I think it's really important when we're thinking about this work that we also acknowledge that university staff will be here with their own experiences, their own weights that they're carrying, and that needs to be acknowledged and supported, both so they can support students better, but also just so they can support each other. So in the workplace, having to juggle your workload with death admin. You might have heard that phrase before, all the things that come with someone dying, having to sort out the will, having to figure out how to close accounts and, maybe taking on more responsibilities in your family. This can be quite a lot to juggle alongside actually going back to work. And even if you have a bereavement leave policy, it's often not enough time really to do all of those things, let alone all the emotional stuff on top of that as well. I've also spoken to various colleagues that have said they found it really hard to focus. There's such a thing as grief brain, which is where you get a lot of fogginess. It's quite hard to remember things. I definitely had this, like at points in my grief where I just couldn't concentrate on anything, and I felt like I was, there was something actually wrong with my brain, and it was actually just that I was grieving. And also trying to balance being a professional when you've got big emotions coming up and they can hit at any time of the day. And I think it's especially important for those in student-facing roles where they feel they have to be kind of switched on a lot and always be the one offering support, to be able to also know how to support yourselves and reach out. So that is a part of the work we're doing and a part of the framework, which I'm going to share about in a little bit. So before I tell you about what I've put in the framework, I wanted to come to you, Nivaetha and Theo, first. So the framework is a practical guide for universities to firstly better understand grief and the issues that are faced by students and staff, but also with practical recommendations to improving support around bereavement through 5 key themes. I wanted to just start off by asking you, what do you think, if you stepped back and looked at universities as a whole, what could universities be doing and thinking about when it comes to supporting people through grief and loss? It's a big question, but Theo, I'll come to you first.
Thanks so much. So I think I'm going to borrow from what you just said around the fact that I think humanity should be kind of central to this process, and approaching students with a sense of humanity, and yes, moving through the process and providing the support that that they need, but kind of also seeing them as like a young person who is going through this horrible thing, and appreciating that. And I think in terms of a slightly more practical recommendation is to think not just about the individual who's in front of you, but I suppose who they're going home to, and trying to take an approach that is more systemic, because I think while universities can provide fantastic support, hopefully with the help of this framework, at least in my experience, the people who are really, really important and coloured my experience of loss at university, to a certain extent, were my friends, and their willingness to engage in conversation with me, my willingness to do the same with them, and so I think supporting those people around you to become grief literate, which I saw is in your framework, which I really like. That's a really key part of this for me.
Yeah, totally. And on that note, wasn't planning to do this, but I'm gonna highlight a resource that Nivi and I created together, which is about supporting a grieving friend, because I think, and in the framework as well, there's a lot of focus on how we provide support directly to individuals and how we also train and equip staff. And I think that's all really important. But actually, like you say, students often want to be supported by their friends. They don't necessarily want to go to a service. They don't want to seek professional counselling. They just want their mates to kind of know what to say, or at least not be awkward about it. And that's up on our website for free. So there's a video and there's also various like tips and stuff. So that's something, in terms of the whole community becoming grief literate. Doesn't mean you're becoming an expert. It doesn't mean friends are expected to become professional counsellors, but just understand a little bit more about what grief is, how it might impact someone, and just a few small things you could do or say to make it a little bit easier.
To jump in there though, I think in the inverse, friends also want to support their friends who are losing someone, who have lost someone, and I think like enabling them to be able to feel like they have the language or they have the approach, and say, you might say something that maybe you later regret, but that's okay. Like, it's important that you're just there and you're listening, and like giving some sense of guidance there. I think that's really appreciated on the other side of things as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think most people have good intentions, and the reason they're not saying or doing things is because they don't want to get it wrong. So I think at the baseline, it's basically just the reassurance. There is no right thing to say, but saying something and at least showing that you care will be better than nothing. Yeah, totally. Nivi, did you want to add anything?
I thought both of those were really, really good suggestions. But just to add on one more tiny thing, I think like having had the opportunity to, meet other people that have experienced loss, I realize how powerful it can be to just meet people with that shared experience. And it also came up in my dissertation that something people really wanted was, a sense of community, or a sense of people, a group that they could keep coming back to and talking about their experience. So I feel like something that could happen in universities is finding a way to create, you know, peer support sessions for students to meet each other and just, yeah, ideally become friends and just check in on each other as needed. And oh, I have a second one. The second one is that, you know, I think it's great if universities make effort to create initiatives, but it is a shame if students don't know anything about it. So as much as efforts are really, really important, I think it's also really important to make sure that that is communicated properly to the students, and it's very clear what resources are available and what the resources can do for you. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. And if anyone is thinking about setting up some sort of peer support group, then we also have a free guide for that on our website, with like very clear practical steps and guidance and top tips and everything like that. So, and do reach out to the Student Grief Network if you need support with that. We've also got a page on our website which signposts to groups, external organisations that have peer support running, because as Nivi said, a lot of students want to speak to other people their age with similar experiences that get it, and to kind of feel part of a community, as opposed to having more like kind of formal structured counselling, although that is also really helpful and for some students is exactly what they need. So you've already touched on a few of these points, but just wanted to introduce the themes of the framework, which is really for universities to address bereavement holistically. So not just thinking about support that people need kind of directly, but how can we step back and look at this and attack it from different levels. So firstly, one of the recommendations is around policy. So how can we create compassionate bereavement policies and also make sure that they are inclusive, that they don't make assumptions, that they are communicated appropriately and kindly, and all of those sorts of things. And the second theme is about training and awareness. So this might be about putting staff through formal training programs, but it might also, as we were just saying, be about signposting friends to resources, like to a short video that just makes them feel a little bit more comfortable. You know, training isn't always a week's program of becoming an expert. It can be really small, subtle things as well. The third thing is around support services. As Nivi said, peer support might be really important there. It might also be looking at counselling. It might also be looking at creative inventions or having like a walk and talk group. I think what's really important when you're thinking about support services for bereaved individuals is not just offering one thing, because we all grieve in such different ways and we all need such different things. Like I found journaling really helpful, for example. Mention journaling to some people and they think, absolutely no way. And yeah, exactly. Get out. And you don't want to put people off for reaching for support if you only have one thing to offer and it doesn't feel right for them. And it's really important to say that you don't have to do this all yourselves. Some of this might be about signposting to local or national organisations that do those things. The fourth theme is around responding to a student or staff death. So this is actually when a death occurs within the university community. We've shared some recommendations there. And then the final theme was exactly what Nivi was just saying around communication. It's no good having all of these things set up. And I know a lot of universities have amazing stuff on offer, but how can you make sure that people know about them, and not just the proactive students that are really researching and taking their time to kind of look through the website? How can you get it out to people that are maybe normally not as proactive? Can you use existing platforms? Can you go through accommodation blocks? Can you go through sports societies? How can you reach people that really need it? And also not just let them know about it, but make sure that it's appealing. You know, make sure you're using language which actually makes students think they want to come to it. Yeah, do look. I'm not going to go into more depth about the framework, but it is freely available to everyone. So please do take a look through all of that and share it far and wide if you find it useful. I'm going to ask two more questions before we move on to the Q&A. So I know that there will be a number of people in the audience working in student-facing roles, and several people submitted questions asking about how they can directly support students. So just briefly, Theo and Nivi, if someone sat here thinking, but how can I help someone in the moment if they come to me? You know, they walk into my office or they come up to my desk and tell me that 2 months ago their dad died, for example. What would you recommend? What would be your advice there? Nivi, I'll come to you first.
I think sometimes it's just about giving them the space to talk and to truly just listen. Because I think that's not necessarily the right thing to say that could fix the problem in this context, but sometimes it's just about asking the right open questions and just trying to understand how difficult it's been for them. And I think that in itself could be a really good first step, just that understanding and acknowledgement.
Thank you. Theo, would you like to share anything?
Just really to echo what Nivi said, I think I would go back to this point around humanity and just being comfortable saying what you really think. Often I find that when people ask me this question, you know, what do I say, or is there something I could do? Like, often the best thing I found is to be authentic and to say, like, maybe actually you know, that thing happened to you. That sounds awful. Would you prefer that I listen to you, or do you want me to provide you with solutions? Like, I think the more that you try and find the right words, the less likely you are to actually get them. And so I think, yeah, meeting people where they're at is important, but yeah, critically, like, listening is key, because both it, you know, holds space, and perhaps, you know, people who are coming to you maybe feel like they haven't had that opportunity yet. But it also gives you more information, right, as a professional, that you can take and say, okay, well, from what I'm hearing, this might be helpful. We have this, we have, you know, etc. So yeah, that's what I'd say.
Yeah, totally. I hear a lot of students that come through the network saying, like, listening is one of the most helpful things. People often don't, grief isn't something we can fix, so people often just want someone to be there with them while they talk through it. But also on the other side, don't force students to go into all the depths, because some students will want to sit and talk to you about that, and some will, you know, it won't be the right place for them. So I always say ask open questions, but try not to intrude as well. You should be able to pick up, you know, does this student want to talk? And in which case, great, go into it. And in some cases, it seems that they want to be more private, and that's also fine. Theo?
Yeah, I think to this point on communication, like, if you're sensing that, I would just directly ask that question. Like, am I going a little bit too far with my questioning? Or, you know, do tell me if I'm overstepping the mark or whatever. Like, I think a lot of this is like giving people the permission space to do what they want to do in that situation. And so as long as I suppose, firstly, give yourself the permission space to be honest and open, and maybe say that, you know, I don't have all the answers, and also apply that same logic to the person who sat in front of you. I think that's I don't think you'll go too far wrong.
Yeah, I think as well, like, it's just can be really simple things. So instead of asking, how are you feeling? You can ask, do you want to talk about how you're feeling? Because then that person has the opportunity to say no. But it also gives them space to talk if they do want to. Yeah, Nivi.
Yeah, I just had one last thing to add. I think it can be quite natural to just sit and try to figure out on your own how you can help. But I think sometimes it's really powerful and helpful to just ask them, is there anything at all I can do to help? And I think if you leave that open of a question with a student, I think if there are ways that you can do things, they would ideally tell you. And I think that can also be really good.
Thank you. I'm aware of time, so I'm going to come to some of the Q&As that are coming in live. And there was also a few that were sent through. We won't get round to all of these, but I think they're all really good stuff to be thinking about. One that's really jumped out to me is someone has shared that they work as a grief counsellor at a university, and many students come asking, am I grieving well? And that there's some anxiety around this. You know, if you don't grieve properly, it will come back later, stronger. And also, like, you know, not doing it right. So would either of you like to share on that? I can definitely say that I've asked that question before. Am I doing this properly? And I don't think there's a right answer to this. And I think reassuring people that there is no right or wrong way to grieve is really important. But also in terms of, so this question has said, you know, if I don't grieve properly, it will come back later and stronger. There's that anxiety. I do think, I mean, we see there's a lot of research around this and a lot of people sharing their personal experiences. When we try and push grief away and we don't process it and we lock it in a box, often, yeah, it does come up later and we can't ignore it. But I don't think this is something to be scared of, because sometimes we're just not ready to feel it. We can't force it. And actually, you know, there's a quote which is there's grace in denial. It's sometimes okay to not think about it, and it's sometimes okay to have a laugh and move on. And really, we need to find a balance, and we can encourage our students to find a balance without forcing them, without making them feel like they're doing it wrong, but to find a balance between processing the grief, acknowledging it, talking about it, giving it space, but also allowing ourselves to, you know, find our normal routine again, connect with people, find distraction. We kind of need both of those to move forward in a healthy way. But I think the more that we put expectation on ourselves, like sometimes we just can't help it. Sometimes we're stuck in the processing of grief, and sometimes we're stuck in distraction and moving forwards. And actually both of those are totally fine. Theo or Nivaetha, did you want to add anything? Theo, I know Theo and I have run groups together for students, and we have spoken a lot about expectation and about how basically we just need to blow expectation out of the water if we can.
That's why I'm smiling every time it comes up. So I think I think so much of what Anna said is really important insofar as, like, in ways resetting expectations and saying, no, there is no right way, and however you feel at the moment, that is okay, as long as, you know, you feel I suppose, like, you're not forcing anything, as in you're not forcing yourself to, like, desperately engage with your grief if you feel like that's not right for you at the moment, or you're not forcing yourself to I don't know, do the inverse and push it away, even though you know you really want to, like, engage with it. That's again, like, creating that permission space is important, but I suppose I think it's also true that there's only so much one professional can do, and in ways, I'm glad that Anna mentioned the work that we've done together at the New Normal, because certainly my own understanding of my grief has been completely shaped through engaging in that space and speaking to people about how they grieve. And, you know, when I initially started Life After, that came from a place of literally just listening to other podcasts and thinking, wow, like, I'm not alone. I'm, you know, this experience that I thought was so singular and was in ways so isolating, it's not just me. Oh, okay, like, and I don't know if I could have come to that perspective, have this perspective that I hold now, without having gone through that process of just literally, like, engaging with other people on it, and to a certain extent finding my own way.
Just to jump in there as well,
Go for
I
it, yeah.
think podcasts are super interesting resources because they allow people to engage in the subject and start understanding their experience and feeling less alone, while also not having to physically step into that space or like expose themselves. So I always recommend them to students. And if you want to find some recommendations on our website, if you go on support for students, there's a few podcasts, including Theo's podcast, recommended there. I think that's a really good step.
I just wanted to jump in and say one more thing. An analogy that also came out of the podcast and work with the new normal is this notion of waves, where sometimes it feels like you're out on the water and it feels choppy and the waves are big and you have to stay afloat and navigate that. And there are other times when it feels calm and the water is tranquil and see-through, however far you want to extend the analogy or metaphor. And I found that like a really effective communication device, not just for myself, but for others, to say that, like, ultimately, in my life at least, like, this stuff isn't going away. Like, I'm going to be 70 and I'm going to still be thinking about my brother, and I'm still going to be thinking about my dad. And at 71, I'm sure I'll be hit by a tidal wave, but the day later could be super calm. And I think being comfortable with the fact that this will shift and morph and surprise you in ways that, when I say this now, like, I don't understand how my grief is going to move forward. I don't know what it's going to do to me. I don't know, it's a companion. And so I think, trying to find ways in which to communicate that fact and not make it sound scary is also helpful, I found.
Yeah, seeing it as a companion as opposed to an enemy, I think, could be helpful. I definitely saw grief as the enemy when I first lost my brother, because it was just too much to bear. But actually, the more I've befriended it, it's still painful and there are still days when it feels out of control and stuff, but actually I feel like it's a part of me, it's not the whole of me. And actually there are difficult elements to that, and there are also beautiful elements to that as well. There's a few more questions which I just wanted to touch on very briefly before we close up today. Someone's asked about peer support groups seeming like an excellent idea, but wondering whether the students who would be good at giving support might not feel like they have the initiative to set them up themselves because they're in the middle of grief, which I totally understand. And actually, often we've had people coming to us wanting to set up groups, and then after a few weeks or months, finding that it's just too much. I think you've suggested in the question about whether former students might be able to help, and I think that's a great idea. But I also think there's no harm in having, say, like a counsellor or someone from the wellbeing team involved. It can still be a peer support group, but if they offer the structure, then, it can be a space for people to chat, but you're the one doing the organising, you're able to help promote it, you're able to be there if something gets a bit stressful and they need support. So there's ways of creating peer support where there's also a little bit of structure from the university or student union themselves. And I also just wanted to come to one question before we end, which was about university staff. How much of yourselves do you offer to your students when you're doing this? Because it might be that you have a conversation with a student and it's triggering, it's difficult, it brings up your own grief. And I would say this is really totally up to you. I think there's an element of, you wanting the boundary in place, and that's totally normal. You might not want to give of yourself and show that personal side, but I also think it's okay. I've had a couple of staff members that have become quite emotional in conversations with them, and actually it made me kind of feel like I was connecting to them human to human, as opposed to, I'm a student and you're here to help me. And really, I always talk about this word ecosystem. we want to be creating an ecosystem of care where it's not about one person up here helping one person down here. It's really about us all being able to muddle through this together. So it's okay if you get emotional. It's an emotional subject. That just makes you human. So I'm going to have to end the session because we've got 1 minute until 1 o'clock. But I just wanted to say thank you so much to everyone for joining us. And of course, thank you, Nivaetha and Theo, for being here as well and sharing. If you would like further support, you can visit the Resource Hub or the Grief Support Guide on the Good Grief website. And you can also visit the Student Grief Network website, where we have a range of resources, including signposting that might be useful and especially relevant to students and younger adults. You can also access the framework there and various free guides and find out more about our training and the other services. Good Grief have more events coming up, so please visit the website. And likewise with the Student Grief Network, please do keep in touch. We've got a session next week where we'll be digging more into the framework, and you can find that on our website or on my LinkedIn. So thank you all so much for coming, and goodbye for now.